Hi, Dad. You're live. Go ahead.
Hi, Jeff. Claiborne Benson here, and we're back in the saddle again to see if we can get this thing running the way it's supposed to be run. This technology and this new business of internet and live broadcasting is a new innovation, and we have to roll with the winds, I suspect, to make it work. But we're back in it and trying to make it work. So. Um, Please bear with us, and we will look forward to an excellent presentation on the book that you have prepared and done. And that book, I have that book ready.
On the screen.
Yeah, on screen. Okay, good. Make a way for liberation, liberty. Wisconsin's African Americans in the Civil War. And most folks would think that there were very few, or if no African Americans in the state of Wisconsin during that period of time. But little do they know there were quite a few, and even there were some that came to Wisconsin for the sole purpose of participating in the Civil War. So I'm gonna, having said all of that, I'm gonna leave that up to you to explain, and I'll from time to time be asking a few questions. And we are looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Thank you very much for the introduction and for your patience in trying to do this presentation again.
Good.
Jamil, can you pull up the PowerPoint? Is it going? Hello, is it on?
Yes, you're good.
You're good.
Okay, good.
You're good.
I was about to panic. Okay. All right. So I'm not sure what bookstores this is available in, but it can be purchased at bookshops.com. I want to start with a couple of quotes. Dying for freedom is not the worst thing that could happen. Being forgotten is. This is a slogan that's used by a number of veteran support groups, POW, MIA, support organizations, etc. I think it really applies to these soldiers too, because they were very deliberately written out of history and are being brought back in by a lot of people who are working on looking up and restoring their story. The other quotes from a couple of Milwaukee icons, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, attributed to Doc Rivers. We continually try to show our love for this country, and the country continually tries to show that it doesn't love us. And given what happened to the veterans after the war in the decades in the late 19th, early 20th century, and with the persistent discrimination and segregation of the military, that quote really applies to these soldiers too. During the presentation, I'm going to mention a lot of names because, again, they've been written out of history, and I want to bring them back and make it clear that these were, living people who had dreams, aspirations, hopes, frustrations, and deserve to be remembered. So the one mentioned here, Shadrach Valentine, he's one of 4 members of his family who served in the Civil War Army from Wisconsin. And on the slides in the future, anyone whose name shows up in red was a soldier. I got started doing this when working as a volunteer at the Civil War Museum in Kenosha. I went to a program about 10 years ago, and there were reenactors portraying Company F, 29th U.S. Colored Infantry. Many of them were employees of the Milwaukee VA hospital at the time. And I was embarrassed to admit to them that I didn't know there were any African-American soldiers from Wisconsin. So they told me that there were, and that's who they were representing as reenactors. So I started researching that company, and then expanded to their whole regiment, and just went on from there. So prior to the war, only a few of the soldiers that we're going to talk about were born in Wisconsin, but there are a number of others who moved into the state before the war began. I'm going to mention one of them, Edward Hunter, because it gives a little bit of an idea of the problems that they have in living in the state in that period. He was a barber in Fond du Lac, Waupac, and Markesan. He was married in Wisconsin to a Stockbridge Indian woman in 1854. In 1860, he was living in Fond du Lac as a barber. And incidentally, his next door neighbor, John Riley, also was a barber and also served in the Civil War as a barber with the Iron Brigade in Virginia. In 1858, Edward Hunter was living in Waupac at the time and was tried to give a speech at an Independence Day event and was heckled, harassed, and driven from the stage by a number of local people who didn't believe he had the right to speak because he was a black man, including throwing firecrackers at him, throwing eggs at him, etc. There were people in the crowd who were appalled at this. They scheduled an event 2 days later and had offered to protect him so that he could deliver the speech he wanted to give the earlier day. He did deliver the speech, but the same people who had attacked him on the stage followed him home, vandalized his house, threw rocks and things at him again. They were arrested, tried, and convicted. One of them was the school teacher, and he lost his job because of it. But I mention this story because it was not an easy place to be as an African American, and also establishes the fact that in these early years and even after the war, the African Americans in Wisconsin were scattered throughout the state. They were primarily rural and small town. So his locations in Fond du Lac, Waupac, and Markesan were pretty typical of that community at the time. So after the war began, first year and a half of the war, people like Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany, who are shown here, were pushing Lincoln to allow African Americans to serve in the Army. And many of them wanted to. Frederick Douglass's sons later did serve. Martin Delany himself served. But for the first year and a half of the war, African Americans were barred from the state militias and were barred from the Federal Army. They could not join in any way. Now, the same thing happened within Wisconsin, too. There was pressure on the governor to open the ranks before the Emancipation Proclamation. And what's showing here is a list of individuals, all African American, who contacted the governor by letter or in person, pressuring him to open the ranks to black soldiers. The ones shown in red again ended up later on becoming soldiers, but in those first year and a half, 2 years of the war, they were not accepted. So Ferdinand Shavers is the man shown here in the picture. He was employed by Abraham Lincoln during his last couple of years in Illinois, during the debates with Stephen Douglas, during the presidential campaign, when he worked as a valet butler for Lincoln. When Lincoln went to Washington to assume the presidency, he decided not to take Shavers with him because he didn't think Shavers would be safe. And again, remember, Lincoln had to kind of came into Washington in secret because he felt his own life was at risk as well. So, but the letters these men wrote to the governor are all documented in the Wisconsin Historical Society archives. The first men of African ancestry to serve from Wisconsin were these two men, John Wales Jefferson, Beverly Jefferson. They were grandsons of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. They were freed by Jefferson. The family moved to Ohio, but in the early 1850s, especially after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, they decided they were going to move on, but decided also at that point that they would move to Madison, Wisconsin, and would pass for white. Changed their last name from Hemings to Jefferson, and they successfully passed for white. As you can see in the pictures, they would not have had a hard time in terms of their appearance passing for white. In terms of blood, they were probably 1/16th African from Sally Hemings' ancestors. But if they had remained in Missouri and had not been freed by Jefferson, they would have been slaves in Virginia, rather. They would have been enslaved there. So John Wales Jefferson apparently ran into one of his former Ohio neighbors while he was in the service, and swore the man to secrecy, not to tell anyone that he was of African ancestry, or he may have lost his high rank in the army. So these were the first two to serve from Wisconsin, but they were not recognized by anyone as having African ancestry at the time they enlisted. Now, after the Emancipation Proclamation, things changed. Part 2 of the proclamation led to the formation of the U.S. Colored Troops. It accepted African American men into the Army, and the state militias were also to follow with that. The U.S. Colored Troops would have white officers above the rank of sergeant. All officers would be white. And the idea was that they would be used for garrison duty, guarding forts, guarding supply lines, doing rear guard, etc. And Lincoln didn't envision them being in combat, and neither did many of the generals. That didn't prove to be the case, however, for a couple of regiments that had men from Wisconsin in them. They saw a lot of combat. So the U.S. Colored Troops is formed. There's recruiting going on in some states, starting with Massachusetts, but not Wisconsin. So in the summer of 1863, though, because of this change, black men were included on the draft rolls that they put together at that time. So in October of 1863, when the draft was held, black men could be drafted, but they could not volunteer in Wisconsin. It was still the case. Many of them wanted to volunteer, and they didn't want to be drafted. For one reason, because they wanted to show that they were willing to fight and not being forced to fight. Many of them, again, having the history with enslavement where they were forced to, everything they did, they were forced to do. But the other difference is volunteers got bounties for enlisting, and draftees did not. So one of the consequences of this was that as other states were recruiting for the U.S. Colored Troops, Wisconsin African American men left the state to volunteer elsewhere: Massachusetts, Indiana, Ohio, and later Illinois. Now, from the drafts in 1863, there were African American men who were drafted in that call-up. And since Wisconsin was still not assigning men to the U.S. Colored Troops, these men went into Wisconsin units. So basically, by the state's inaction in terms of recruiting for the U.S. Colored Troops, the color line was broken in Wisconsin cavalry and infantry regiments, and black men were serving with white men. That lasted as long as the war did, but as soon as the war ended, the color line came up again, and the Wisconsin militia was again all white. Wisconsin began accepting black volunteers from mid-March 1864, and almost all of them went to the U.S. Colored Troops. They went to Camp Randall first for initial processing and training. Volunteers from late March to June all went to Company F, 29th U.S. Colored Infantry, which was called the Milwaukee Company for reasons I'll explain later. And that's the group that the reenactors portray. This regiment trained at Quincy, Illinois, right on the Mississippi River. From July 1864 on, then, all Wisconsin recruits, after going to Camp Randall initially, were sent on to St. Louis for assignment to their regiment. The first Wisconsin African American volunteers signed up in Green Bay in mid-March to early April 1864. 18 of them. 13 were credited to Greenville Township, Outagamie County. What being credited meant was that the service of each man who volunteered or was drafted was credited to a town, village, or ward in the city. And that service would reduce that town's draft quota by 1. So what happened here was 13 of these guys were credited to Greenville Township. And Greenville Township, therefore, had no draft the next time there was a call-up. This sounds corrupt, and it was. It was a political decision made, in this case in Green Bay, by the provost marshal, doing a favor for someone. So 13 of the 18 men had their service credited to Greenville Township. None of them lived there. So ideally, your service should be credited to where you're living, but none of these men were credited to where they lived. All of them ended up serving in the 68th U.S. Colored Infantry, which saw significant combat and hardship, and 4 of the men in this group, including the ones shown there, died in service. On the right, Corporal Charles Rollins was born in Racine, lived in Oshkosh, volunteered to Green Bay, and again, he was one of the ones credited to Greenville Township. He was one of the very few in this group that was never hospitalized, but his last couple months he served basically with a hospital unit, with an ambulance unit, because they were seeing high casualties as well as disease. Now, so again, service was credited to a locality. Many of the African American men who went into the service after summer of 1864 were substitutes. In the first drafts in 1862 and 3, men with the money could pay a $300 fee to be exempt from the draft. And so many of them did. What happened is that the Union needed men more than they needed the money at this point. So at the draft in 1864, if you were drafted, you either had to serve or get a substitute. So there were people who acted as agents looking for substitutes, and the agents got $300 to go find a substitute. By the end of the war, this was up to $800. How much of this money actually went to the substitute, the man serving in place of the drafted man, was up to the agent. The agents, there was a lot of corruption in this too. The agents gave as little money as they felt they needed to get the man to agree to be a substitute. So on the left here are descriptive books for 2 men who served as substitutes. William Riley was a substitute for Frederick Ilsley. If you remember Marshall Ilsley Bank, it's one of the founders of the bank. And the William Turner served as a substitute for Joseph Schlitz, whose name we all know as the brewer. Not everybody, however, who paid for a substitute was rich. And one of the examples of this was in Milwaukee. There were groups of draft eligible men who would get together from a ward, would pool their money, and if any of them were drafted, they'd take money out of that fund to look for substitutes or pay for a bounty to someone to serve in order to reduce their draft quota, or for one individual not to be drafted. So this comes up in this story. The form on the right is a claim for compensation for an enlisted slave. When U.S. colored troops formed, one of Lincoln's concessions again to the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, was that if any enslaved man from those states enlisted in the Army, the owner could apply for compensation. So this is a form filled out by the former owner of Lewis Orr, who enlisted May 21st, 1864 in Missouri. Again, remember the training camp for the 29th U.S. Colored Infantry was right on the Mississippi River. So many of the men who joined that company, and I'll give you the numbers in a little while, many of these men were Missouri men who had signed up, had come across the river on their own, or actually had recruiters going into Missouri signing them up. He was credited to Milwaukee because the recruiters for Company F had money from the draft clubs in Milwaukee to use as a bounty for these men who signed up, so that their service would be credited to Milwaukee and reduce the draft quota. So that's how it came to be that there was a large number of Missouri men who had never actually been in Milwaukee but signed up, volunteered, and were credited to Milwaukee. This was about the only case where there was effective recruitment of black men who weren't from Wisconsin to serve with their service credited to Milwaukee. So in the case of Lewis Orr, his former owner, Lucy Orr, went to the camp in Quincy, Illinois, tried to reclaim him, met with an officer who called Lewis Orr in and said, "Do you know this woman?" And he said, "Yes." And he asked the Mrs. Orr, "No, is this Lewis Orr?" She said, "Yes." Well, he's a soldier now, so he's now free. You can't have him back. So I've always been curious about what these men thought at this point, because this happened often enough that at that camp they had these forms available, and they also had a printed form that the officer filled out to document any time that a former owner had come looking to reclaim a soldier. These claims were never paid. So they filed the claim, she signed a loyalty oath on the bottom. But the claims were never paid because by the time Congress got around to appropriating money for it, it was 1867, and they weren't going to put money into this. So the compensation claims were never paid. So here are the numbers. On Company F-29th U.S. Colored Infantry, the Milwaukee Company, there were 11 recruits credited to Illinois, including one Racine man, John Briggs, who enlisted in Chicago because at that point he didn't know that Wisconsin was accepting recruits. There were 64 men credited to Milwaukee, like Lewis Orr, almost all of them recently escaping enslavement from Missouri. There were 18 men who enlisted in and were credited to Wisconsin. However, not one of them was credited their actual place of residence. Again, this was a political decision made in Madison so that men who were from Vernon County, from the Cheyenne Valley community in Vernon County, had their service credited to Kewaunee County as a political favor to someone. So of the 18 Wisconsin enlistees, 8 of them served at some point as non-commissioned officers. And part of the reason for this was that most of the men in the company had been enslaved until weeks or months before they joined the Army, or days. The men who enlisted in Wisconsin's, quite a few of them had been born in the North or had spent some time in the North or in Wisconsin. So they were much more likely to be literate and be able to do some of the duties of an officer. So again, all of these men trained at Camp Quincy. They trained without weapons. Their entire training time, they had no weapons, no ammunition. And they left Quincy July 8th, arrived at Petersburg July 15th, joining the other 5 companies in the siege of Petersburg. This was not too long after the Battle of Fort Pillow, where the Confederate Army had killed black soldiers and their white officers they had taken prisoner. And the Confederate government had said, we will give no quarter to black soldiers or their white officers. So that had happened just recently, and these soldiers went into the battle assuming that was still the case. So of the company of 88 men went into action at the crater. What happened at the crater was some Pennsylvania soldiers who were coal miners dug a long tunnel way underneath Confederate lines, filled it with explosives, and it was blown up early in the morning of July 30th. The Black Division, the division of U.S. Colored Troops, was supposed to lead the attack immediately after the explosion, and they had practiced maneuvers in order to do that. The night before, General Grant and General Meade changed the orders and said, no, we don't want to send them into battle in the lead, or we'll be accused of using them as cannon fodder. They sent, even though they were motivated and wanted to do it, they assigned the lead to a white division that was poorly led, very worn out. And when the explosion happened, they didn't move. There was no action whatsoever. But they're sitting there idle, impeded everyone else from going forward. So 4 hours after the explosion, with the element of surprise completely lost, the Black Division had finally worked its way forward and was able to move. And there are mentions in diaries of white soldiers from other states, including some from Wisconsin, who said that they felt terrible watching the Black Division move forward in spite of the fact that they had absolutely no hope of succeeding, but they went anyway. And should have been the ones leading the charge in the first place, but they weren't. And Grant later admitted it was a mistake to pull them off the lead. So of these 88 men who went into that battle, 10 were killed in action or died shortly after from wounds, including Richard Robinson and William Ross, both of whom enlisted in Wisconsin. There were at least 23 others who were wounded, in this battle. All of them were buried in mass field graves right on the spot. And after the war, they were reinterred at Poplar Grove National Cemetery. All of them are buried in graves marked unknown. Now, in this battle, some of these 10 men may actually have been killed after they were captured. But there were at least 5 soldiers from the 29th who were taken as prisoners of war and survived their captivity. So one of the reasons this changed with the Battle of the Crater was that Lincoln had issued an order at that point that if any black soldiers or their officers were killed as prisoners of war, the Union Army would retaliate by killing a Confederate prisoner. And so at this point, that threat was taking effect, and that basically after this battle, there may not have been any more cases of soldiers being killed and officers being killed after being taken prisoner. So these are the men who were captured and taken as prisoners of war. Thomas Burnett is a fascinating story all by himself, but I can't go into it here. He lived in Oshkosh and Milwaukee before the war, and this is a memorandum of his time as a prisoner of war. And he did come back to Wisconsin afterwards, after his service. So following that, the failure of that battle, the 29th U.S. Colored Infantry stayed involved in the siege of Petersburg, replenished their losses, including some men from Wisconsin. They participated in action at Hatcher's Run, and in the spring, when they attacked Petersburg, conquered Petersburg, Richmond, and went after what was left of Lee's army. The night before Lee surrendered, the division of the U.S. Colored Troops marched the entire night without sleep and arrived at Appomattox just in time to block Lee's only escape route from the area. So basically, they forced the surrender. So George Washington Williams was an African-American historian and a veteran of the Civil War who wrote a history of the black soldiers, and also wrote a general history of African-American history of the U.S. up to that point, who has a quote that the last guns fired at Lee's army were in the hands of Negro soldiers, and more than 100 of those soldiers were from Wisconsin. I want to mention this guy. He's one of the most interesting ones in this company. He was Lloyd Bryan. He was born in Pennsylvania. He was a barber, attended college, according to one of his tent mates. He was on the draft rolls in Berlin, volunteered, and he, unlike most other companies, he was a good enough writer that he kept the regimental book. Usually this was assigned to a white officer, but he kept the book in this case because he was a good writer. And the quote from him is, "This company shared in the memorable campaign which resulted in the fall of Richmond, the surrender of General Lee with the Army of North Virginia. The company marched in the aggregate 250 miles and is now encamped near Petersburg, Virginia." So this is a note he wrote after they were done marching and had returned to Petersburg. Now, they weren't done with their service. They were sent to Texas later on, but that's another story. The picture on the right is a building in Alexandria, Virginia, that was the headquarters for several decades for a business of slave traders. So that's what the historical marker there is referring to. Around the corner is another historical marker that notes that this building and a number of other buildings around it became Louverture Hospital, which was a hospital for African Americans who were sick or wounded in the Northern Virginia area. It was started after the U.S. Colored Troops was formed, named for Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian revolutionary. What happened here, though, after the hospital opened, that men who died here were buried in a pauper cemetery about a mile away, rather than in the military cemetery, which is only a 2-block walk from the hospital. So the soldiers there got a petition drive and protested this. They wanted to be buried as soldiers. They were suffering and dying as soldiers, or recovering, but they were soldiers and wanted to be buried there. And they won the right to be buried there. One Wisconsin man, Wade Hampton, had been buried in the pauper cemetery. He was reinterred at Alexandria National Cemetery, which is shown on the right. And one of the leaders of that protest was Sergeant Alfred Carroll, who was born in Milwaukee and was in Company D of the 29th U.S. Colored Infantry. Another protest during the war, which you'll remember if you saw the movie Glory, was the 54th and 55th Massachusetts infantry soldiers refused all pay, so did their white officers, until it was made equal to white soldiers' pay. For a year and a half they served and got no pay because they wouldn't take it until it was made equal. Congress finally got around to basically creating a single pay level for all soldiers, at which point these guys were paid. And I mention this here because there were at least 11 Wisconsin men in those two regiments. Their names are listed below. Arthur B. Lee lived in Milton. John Tucker was with the 54th Massachusetts as well. He was from Racine. So after the war, most black veterans returned to their pre-war places of residence. There were some positive changes that resulted from their service. Obviously, the end of slavery, but also the equal pay issue, burial and pension rights. They had the right to go into soldiers' homes and became a permanent part of the Army, but still segregated. As the 1800s went on, their acceptance eroded. The men who served were accepted and respected for their service, but found themselves more and more isolated and rejected because of their race. And this was not just in Wisconsin. There was a rise in racism nationally, as well as locally. There was a decline in the black rural and small town population, which even for the first 20 years after the war was still primarily where African Americans lived in Wisconsin. And restricted job and residential opportunities got worse as the decades moved on. The U.S. colored troops and the non-enlisted service by African Americans were largely erased from history. And as an example of this, in 1903, there was a reunion for the Crater Battle. And on the Union side in that battle, of the 10 regiments with the highest casualties, 7 were U.S. colored troops. Not one of the officers or soldiers from the U.S. colored troops was invited to participate in the reunion. It was all white on both sides. So that's the extent to which the service of black veterans had already been erased from public memory. Henry Roseman was a man drafted into a Wisconsin regiment, lived in Beaver Dam before the war, came back to Beaver Dam after the war, and was accosted on the street by a group of white veterans who basically beat him. He and they were taken to court immediately, and the attackers were fined a couple dollars each, and everybody went back out in the street. They jumped him again and beat him even worse. Same men were arrested. One of them ran away. Another one was ordered to leave town, but not a very warm reception. And the Democratic newspaper supported the white soldiers, didn't mention that Roseman was also a veteran, and didn't give the names of the assailants. The Republican paper named Roseman, mentioned that he was a veteran too, and gave the names of the men who led the attack. So there's a pretty polarized, divided situation in that town. Henry Roseman didn't stay long. He left town shortly after this. And later in life, although he did learn to write very well later on, was the more typical example of the extreme poverty that a lot of these veterans endured late in life. The Wisconsin veterans also contributed to the struggle for black male suffrage. A petition was drafted, signed by 105 men to get a referendum on the ballot for black male voting rights. And they cite in the petition body that we've served in the military and we deserve the right to vote on how, when, and where our service is needed. At least 8 of the signers of that petition were veterans or soldiers still on active duty. And these are mostly men from Milwaukee and La Crosse. And if you notice the third name on the right, that's Gillespie. That's Ezekiel Gillespie, who tried to vote in the election in fall of 1865, where that referendum actually lost, but he was arrested for trying to vote, and his court case ended up with the Wisconsin Supreme Court decision that black men had the right to vote in the state. One of the best sources for information on the lives of these men are their pension files, which you can only get by going in person to the National Archives in Washington. The one that I've chosen to highlight here is a man named Caleb Hudson, who later changed his name to Tom Taylor for reasons that'll be clear in a minute. He enlisted at La Crosse, signed his name with an X, served in the 18th U.S. Colored Infantry. Before the war, he had been enslaved in Kentucky, and in his pension documents, he actually gives the name of the plantation owner, the man who owned him. So, for a genealogist working from the present back, the Civil War pension files are just a gold mine. So I could get all those because I knew who I was looking for. A genealogist now working back to the past has a lot of trouble getting back to this time on account of many of the name changes that happened or that people moved around so much. But in his file, besides giving the name of his owner, he also said, "I never knew who my father was, and my mother was sold away from me when I was a small child." He came to La Crosse because he was steamboating. He worked on the river. He fought in the Battle of Nashville. There's conflicting information about his wounds or injuries, but they were sufficient to allow him to apply for and get an invalid pension later on in life. His pension file, I found another half dozen Wisconsin soldiers in it, mentioned in his pension file that I might not have found otherwise. Which proves a point that'll come up later, that these guys were connected and stayed in touch with each other. After the war, Caleb Hudson went back to Kentucky to look for his mother and never found her. After that experience, he changed his name. I think he still used Hudson when he enlisted, but he became a Buffalo soldier, serving out west for 3 years. Later changed his name to Tom Taylor. And much later in life, he was a resident of Melvin, Oklahoma, which was one of the all-black towns that was created there in order for the residents to not have to deal on a daily basis with the degradation and humiliation of being in a town where they were second or third class citizens. What's shown on the right here is his pension card, which shows the name change, that he applied for an invalid pension and got the pension. The additional services here documents his service as a Buffalo soldier, and on the bottom is his information on his death. One of the comments in his pension file is from a pension examiner who went to Melvin, Oklahoma to investigate him, and basically said, the population of this town is all colored, therefore not reliable witnesses. So he basically rated everyone in the town as a fair witness rather than good or excellent because of their race. But in spite of that, he did get a pension. So now I'll show a number of pictures here, and then we'll wrap up. And I bring these two up first because these two men served as employees of Wisconsin regiments. They were not soldiers. They were employees. So James Ellis served with the 29th Wisconsin Infantry, lived later in life in Fort Atkinson. This photo is from the Civil War Museum in Kenosha. His name was placed on the roster of his regiment as a cook. But because he was on a roster, he later on was able to apply for a pension. He could have lived in a soldier's home, and he had the right to be buried as a soldier. Henry Ashby, on the other hand, served for 3 years with the Wisconsin Light Artillery, lived in Eagle River later in life. And this photo is from the Wisconsin Veterans Museum in Madison. He was never placed on a roster. So when he later in life tried to apply for a pension, he didn't get it. Even though officers of the regiment he was in, he served for over 3 years. He went into battle with a weapon. He was wounded, but they never put his name on the roster because he was an employee, not an enlisted soldier. Therefore, in spite of everything he did during the war, he did not qualify for a pension. The Pension Bureau was absolutely rigid on that, and they never gave in. This picture is of Arthur B. Lee, who was commissary sergeant in the 54th Massachusetts, present at the Battle of Fort Wagner, and served with them for the duration of the war. I went to Milton House Museum in Milton, and they had in their documents this beautiful leather-bound book, which are still in existence for some posts of the Grand Army of the Republic, the Civil War Veterans Organization. To become a GAR member, you needed to be an honorably discharged veteran and to be accepted by a vote of the members of your post. There weren't enough African-American veterans in any town in Milwaukee to form their own posts, so the guys who wanted to join applied to their predominantly white posts in town. The first time I found a black member, I was a little surprised, but many of these guys were accepted as members of their local posts. And people like Arthur B. Lee, for example, was actually elected an officer of the GAR post in Milton. I think he was a vice commander. I forget what the exact title was. But in this book, each member has a page to himself where he describes his war experiences. And one of the questions on his page was, who were your best friends as comrades in the service? And his best friend that he had maintained contact with for all over the years was Frederick Douglass Jr. So the museum there had this book. I had his pictures, so we made a swap on that. So I got some pictures from their book, and they finally have a picture of their most famous black Civil War veteran. Wisconsin Veterans Museum has a picture of Horace Ardis, served with the 31st U.S. Colored Infantry, came to Wisconsin after the war. I went to Appomattox because his unit was in the final battle at Appomattox, and went through the museum there. Notice that in the big hall that you go into, that everybody goes into, the welcome room, the only African-American soldier, not even soldier, present there is a man who was enslaved by a Confederate officer who was present during the fighting at Appomattox. There is no mention, and there was no mention, no sign at all of the U.S. colored troops who were there. But there was this building way in the back of the grounds that the map said was a display on the U.S. colored troops at Appomattox. So I went back to this building, and it was padlocked. So I went back up to the Welcome Center and said, how come the building is padlocked? I want to go in and see it. So they unlocked it, waited for me to go in and look around. When I came out, they padlocked again. So why is this building padlocked? Why isn't this open? But the thing that I saw there that surprised me was I knew who Horace Ardis was already. His name is mentioned in this building at Appomattox as being a local soldier from that part of Virginia who was present at the battle. So I later wrote a letter to the director of the Appomattox site about what I had experienced there, and I hope it's changed, and I hope that the U.S. colored troops are now mentioned in the Welcome Center and that the display is now open to the public. John J. Valentine was a very late enlistee, one of the oldest. I believe he was 42 when he volunteered. In later life, he was a very successful businessman. He ran a restaurant and a hotel in Waukesha, and lived briefly in Milton and Janesville after the war as well. And this photo came from a family member. William Stanton was the son of Moses Stanton, who was the founder of the town of Chilton, Wisconsin. He served in the 16th Wisconsin Infantry, as did two of two of his brothers. And you'll notice on the lapels of each of these men, they have their GAR badges. Most of the pictures that I have of the veterans, of the black veterans of the Civil War from Wisconsin, are pictures that were taken of them with their GAR badges on. That the posts often took pictures of the members, and for many of these guys, it was probably the only portrait picture that was ever taken of them in their lives. I went to a couple of meetings of the African American Genealogical Society of Milwaukee and found out about two other men who served. Alfred Madsen was an employee, a cook in 3 different Wisconsin regiments, and this picture came from family members and also was printed in the Delavan Enterprise a few years ago. That he later in life was a barber in Delavan, and one of his descendants is a member of the Genealogical Society. Another member of the society brought me this document, which was for a soldier admitted to the Milwaukee Soldiers Home on the VA grounds. And she thought this might be a relative of hers, but wasn't sure. So I told her I was going to the National Archives in a couple of weeks. I would look up his pension file. He had one, and combining what she had and what I had, we were able to figure out that she was his ancestor. That this soldier was her ancestor. He had been drafted into the 51st Wisconsin Infantry, served the duration of the war, and I don't know if he lived here after the war, but he did come back to Wisconsin toward the end of his life and was at the Soldiers' Home. So this shows his enlistment in Columbus and a little history of his service. William Reed was a soldier in Company F, 29th U.S. Colored Infantry. The big patch of blank snow in the middle of this picture was his burial site. He was buried in an unmarked grave in 1905 at Forest Home Cemetery in Milwaukee. I brought this back to the Company F reenactors, and they worked with some folks to get a new tombstone for William Reed's gravesite. It's now a marked site, and they did an installation of the new headstone on Memorial Day in 2016. There are still soldiers around Wisconsin black soldiers who are buried in unmarked graves. And this is one of the things that I really hope comes out of all this, that they're remembered and respected for their service. William P. Stewart was also in that company. He was a resident of the Cheyenne Valley settlement in Vernon County. In the mid-50s, came back to it after the war. He married Eliza, the sister of Abraham Thornton, and his own sister, Martha, married Aaron Roberts. Both of these men were his comrades in Company F. And I raise this because they're in the book, I have 2 pages of listings of marriages that happened between the veterans and the sisters, daughters, and mothers of their comrades. In the pension files, there are many, many affidavits in support of pension applications among the soldiers in Wisconsin. There are books that have stated that the black soldiers did not maintain contact with each other after the war because they came from all over and so many of them were illiterate. I don't find that to be the case at all with the men who served from Wisconsin. They were very much in contact with each other and part of each other's lives for the duration of their lives. So after service, in the 1870s, William P. Stewart moved to Peshtigo and later moved to Washington State. This is the first picture I ever found of any of the soldiers, and that this is a picture from his great-granddaughters. It was posted on a website in the state of Washington. And his story relates to the debate about Confederate monuments. Most of these were put up long after the war was over and long after most of the soldiers had died. This is a marker for the Jefferson Davis Highway in Washington State, nowhere near the Confederacy, erected by the Washington Division of the United Daughters of the Confederacy in the early 20th century. This is the highway that runs from Seattle up to the Canadian border. In the early 2000s, the Washington legislature tried to get this changed. The United Daughters of the Confederacy still had some sway there, and blocked it in the state Senate. But about 4 years ago, it came up again, and the highway was finally renamed, and it was renamed the William P. Stewart Memorial Highway for that Wisconsin veteran who served in Company F 29th U.S. Colored Infantry and moved to Washington later in life. So the end result of all this, well, it's not over. I found a total of 472 enlisted servicemen from Wisconsin. And I think there are many more to be found in the Wisconsin infantry and cavalry regiments, because there's nothing in the scant records there that clearly indicates race. So I think there are more there. There are 181 who are employed by Wisconsin regiments or officers listed on rosters. There are probably thousands of men and women who worked for Wisconsin regiments and were never listed on rosters. And I've only been able to document 38 of them so far. And there were at least 32 other black soldiers who are residents of the National Soldiers Home in Milwaukee. And these aren't included in the count. So the total I have is 691, and it's still going up. So I'll stop there and leave it open for questions if anyone has any. I'm glad to see you're still there.
It was quite interesting. I really enjoyed it. I have a question. In 1865, when Ezekiel wants to vote, and he encourage, ask, or now I'm assuming that we're not just talking about black veterans who fill out this petition, but there are white veterans as well.
That petition was signed entirely by black veterans, or not black veterans, but African American men, including black veterans or active duty servicemen.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. So I went down the list. There's 8 that I could confirm were veterans or still on active duty. There might be more.
So how many actually appeared on that list then?
105.
100.
That was just the first page.
Okay.
What showed on the slide was just the first page. The second, I think the third page, there's a whole list of lacrosse men altogether.
Were they white or black?
Black.
Black, okay.
Well, one of the guys I'd mentioned on an earlier slide, John Burney, was a barber in La Crosse. He wrote a letter to a banker after the Emancipation Proclamation saying, I want to try and recruit a company of soldiers here. And the banker forwarded that to the governor and said, here, this guy would be excellent as an officer. Give him a commission. Said, no, we're just not doing it. He wasn't interested and just said, no, that's not happening. So, but Bernie was an interesting character. He ended up not serving in the army, but most of those guys who did contact the governor in person or by mail did end up serving in the army.
And so, did they lobby the legislature also, or did they just do the petition?
They did the petition, and some of them appeared in person. The legislature agreed, and they put the referendum on the ballot for November of that year. And even though the Republican slate swept all the statewide elections, the referendum lost. And part of the reason was none of the Republicans campaigned actively for the referendum. They kind of stayed away from it completely. So it lost. So when Gillespie tried to vote in his local precinct, he was arrested. The case went to the Supreme Court, and they reinterpreted a previous referendum as having passed, and saying that, well, they should have had the right to vote from 1849 on. So that was how the right to vote was won, because Gillespie took the chance to vote, was arrested, and won his case.
Wow.
But the La Crosse people were really involved in this, and the Prescott, which is way up in the far northwestern part of the state, had a black suffrage meeting while Gillespie's case was still in court, and sent a statement, a resolution they had passed to the legislature and to the Supreme Court supporting the right to vote. So that was.
Were there African Americans up there, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. In 1870,
What city was
probably
that?
the biggest collect,
What city was that?
go ahead,
What city was that we're talking about?
Prescott.
Prescott. Okay.
Yeah. It's
Okay.
right. It's right on where the Mississippi and St. Croix come together,
Yeah.
near St. Paul.
Okay.
But they had a fairly. It's. I describe it in the book that the black veterans and the black families who came there were surprisingly well accepted when they first arrived. It's one of the larger populations where there was no separate black church started because they were invited to join the white churches,
Okay.
Baptist and Presbyterian. And one of the members of this community was a minister, but he had his church across the river in Minnesota. So initially very accepted. In fact, there was a white church group that raised money to just basically provide short-term help to families as they arrived. But it really eroded as time went by, and there's in a nearby town, the county seat, there was after World War I, there was a rumor going around that a black man had applied for membership in the American Legion, and it was quite a scandal because everyone whose members showed up to vote against his application. So this just indicates the change in hostility, basically.
Yes.
From the end of the Civil War to the early 1900s, and basically in the same county. So a lot of the Prescott community was actually a small farming community, a few miles east of Prescott.
So my second question, I have three of them. I hope I can get them in. My second question is, you're saying that a large contingent of African Americans, probably the 29th, but I'm not sure, was in Richmond at the end of the war, and what did they do, or did they help capture Jefferson Davis?
No, none of them were involved in the capture of Davis. Davis escaped prior to the Union Army taking over Petersburg and Richmond, but the 29th and several other regiments, 23rd and a couple others, had Wisconsin men, and they were part of a division that was entirely U.S. colored troops. That was part of the final attack on Petersburg, capturing Petersburg. And there are things in the pension files with these guys describing marching through the streets of Petersburg and Richmond and being cheered by the black residents of the town.
Okay.
But after they captured Petersburg and Richmond, they kept going because they were after Lee's army. Lee's army had escaped and was going west and south and trying to unite with Johnston's army further south. And Sherman was after him from the south. So if Lee had been able to get out of Appomattox, though, the war would have gone on a bit longer. But these guys, including the 29th, did that all-night march to get there and block off the last escape route that Lee had. I was out there with a hiking group doing part of the Appalachian Trail, and one of the days we actually marched to the spot where that final confrontation happened, where Lee's army was trying to march out, and the Black Division had arrived there a half hour before. Lee's army came upon them, so they were ready for him, and that was the end of it.
What was the name of that group? What unit was that? Was that the 29th or what?
29th was in it, yeah.
Was in it?
Yeah. But it was entire division.
Oh, okay.
So multiple regiments, but all U.S. colored troops. So if they hadn't made it, the war would have gone on a lot longer, a bit longer anyway.
You said Pestigo. A Stewart goes to Pestigo.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So does Pestigo have an African American population there?
No. This was very typical for a lot of these guys. A lot of their obituaries read the last colored man in town.
Okay.
So he probably was the only one. Ansel Clark in Portage was the only black man in town by the time he died. So Richardson in Evansville, same thing. So you see a lot of obituaries like that. Or Stubblefield, way up north in Butternut. So he would have been the only one. He was a member of the GAR post in Peshtigo. He was their chaplain. So he wasn't a minister of any kind, but he was elected, voted as chaplain of the post.
Okay.
So, and he was there for, I don't know exactly how long, but 10 or 15 years, I'm saying at least. He moved there after the big fire. And his work up there, he was in the lumber, and he was a lumberman.
Okay. So he was needed, obviously, from the. So then you mentioned a gentleman from Racine, but you didn't mention the coroner, and I've forgotten the coroner's name, but the coroner was a nurse. It was a nurse in the Civil War, and later returned home to become the coroner.
He's a very interesting story. That's Peter D. Thomas.
Yes.
He was an employee of a Wisconsin regiment, working for an officer. He came back to Wisconsin with the officer who was sick and helped to take care of him. But when Wisconsin opened up recruitment for the U.S. Colored Troops, he enlisted, served in the 18th U.S. Colored Infantry, came back to Wisconsin, in the Rock County. He signed his enlistment paper with an X. He ended up going to school. He ended up going to Beloit College for a while. Couldn't find work in Wisconsin. So he went to Chicago for some years and worked as a teacher. But came back to Wisconsin to Racine, and he became a member of the People's Party, or the Union Labor Party, in 1886. And two of the founders of that party were African-American men from La Crosse, including one veteran. And they ran a slate of candidates for statewide office, local offices, because that was founded because they didn't think either party was representing working people. And it was right after the 8-hour strikes in Milwaukee, where the National Guard had shot a number of strikers.
Yeah.
So these two guys from different corners of the state ended up in the same party. And Peter D. Thomas was the candidate for coroner, and the Union Labor Party swept all the county offices in Racine, and quite a few in Milwaukee in the fall election that year. So, very interesting man. Another thing about him was that he signed his enlistment papers with an X, but he became an extremely good writer and wrote articles or opinion columns for a couple of newspapers, African-American owned newspapers in Milwaukee in the late 1800s.
So what are those papers? How would I find them?
They're incomplete, but they have them on microfilm at the Historical Society in Madison.
Okay.
Let's see.
So there would be Racine papers, is that right?
No, they're Milwaukee papers.
Milwaukee papers, okay.
Weekly Wisconsin Advocate is one of them. Northwestern Reporter is another, not to be confused with the one from Oshkosh. And I can get you the names later on.
Sure, thank you.
I was surprised to find them. I didn't know there were any at that time, but there were 3.
Yeah.
A couple of them overlapped in years.
So I have one other question, if I could, please. So Fond du Lac and Fox Point gets a large grouping of African Americans, 1862, to settle in those areas.
Mm-hmm.
Did any of them enlist into the service?
Yes.
Either from Fond du Lac or Fox Lake?
Yes. Those were groups who were at what were called contraband camps. They were Illinois, and they were brought up by rail. Federal government had a policy that lasted for about 6 months that proved to be very unpopular, but there were 3 groups that came to Wisconsin, one to Fond du Lac, one to Racine, and the one to Fox Lake. And one of the reasons for doing it was to relieve the stress in these camps, because they had so many people, and to relieve the Army of responsibility for caring for them. most of them were women, children, and older men, because the Army took as employees anybody who was younger, male, and able-bodied. But those three cities, Racine, Fond du Lac, and Fox Lake, were really the largest, as well as Prescott, the largest African-American communities in the state in the post-war decades, because of these groups of people who were brought in during the war.
So Racine had a contingent of...
Racine did too. It's not very well documented, but was very unpopular with the Democratic press, and the Racine Republican congressman lost his reelection bid because he was, the Democratic press tied him to the arrival of the contrabands, and they were saying they're going to steal our jobs, wages are going to go down, things like that. So he lost, and the Fond du Lac also had a Republican congressman, and the same election, a Democrat was elected to replace him. So there were some political repercussions from that.
How many people would you say, because 195 to 100 in both of those other cities, Fox Lake and Fond du Lac, how many people would you say came to Racine, please?
I have not seen a number.
Okay.
Fond du Lac was over 100.
Yes.
There's all kinds of numbers within that range.
Yeah.
Fox Lake was a lot smaller group, but yes, there were men from two men from Fox Lake at least who came in with that group, later enlisted. Hayden Netter and Wesley Walter, and from Fond du Lac, Lewis Gaines was in that group and later enlisted, and he served in Company F of the 29th U.S. Colored Infantry.
So there was, okay, there was.
Yep.
But those communities, just as a personal point of view here, those communities saw them as not as opening their doors, but possible servants or workers to do the work that they thought that they had made a sacrifice by sending their young youth and sons and nephews and nieces to the war, and so they thought that they should be compensated by this labor pool that was available through domestic work and farm working.
No, the director of the contraband camp at Cairo, Illinois, was a minister from Fond du Lac, and so he accompanied the group that went to Fond du Lac. He came up with them on the train.
Yes.
And
Square.
So he still had a home there. His wife and I think he had kids. Still had a home there, but shortly after this, while he was still in Fond du Lac, there were rocks thrown through his bedroom window. So he was not popular for what he had done. Interesting end to his story was that he went back into the Army, but not in a Wisconsin unit. He became an officer of a U.S. Colored Infantry unit, serving in the Delta region in Mississippi, and died in service.
Okay. That's interesting. Okay. That's all I have. If there aren't any other questions, we're good. Okay. If there aren't any other questions, we're going to close out. I learned a lot today. And I appreciate your comments and your thoughts and your research. I'm going to look at this again myself so that I can learn some more. And we'll be asking you more questions in the future.
Okay. Well, again, thank you very much for having me and for your patience with the technology.
Oh, it's okay.
And
sorry.
We'll be in contact again. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Talk to you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.